So one of the main stumbling blocks in early Buddhism to our problems in the world has to do with our self-identity views, the way we see ourselves, the way we identify ourselves. And I'm going to try to break this down into 5 different categories, coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing to the channel. So one of our deepest and most trenchant issues for the Buddha was this notion of self-identity, the way we identify ourselves, the way we cling to certain kinds of identities. And the Buddha broke down the person, the human person, into 5 what he called aggregates. And what he would tend to do in many of the suttas was to describe this notion of self-identity and the way that we identify with things in the world and with parts of ourselves in terms of these 5 aggregates. And so what I'm going to do is to go through the 5 aggregates and show the ways that each of the aggregates highlights a way that we can identify ourselves and cling to that identity. So the first of the aggregates is form, which is another way of saying physical stuff. So many of us, of course, identify with our bodies. That's a clear one. We identify with the beauty of our bodies. We identify with youth. The youth of our bodies, a certain way that we our body happens to line up, if you like. We identify with our strength. Many of us who, let's say, play sports or work out, may have a self-identity around those abilities, those physical abilities that we have. We may also self-identify around gender, which is a kind of a physical attribute. I mean, there are the 2 standard genders, but there are also other genders as well that can occur from time to time in humans and other animals. And so all of these can become ways that we self-identify and identify ourselves in contrast to other things. Because we also have to remember, in all of what I'm going to be discussing, identity is kind of a 2-way street. We identify ourselves with something, but in virtually every case, that also involves identifying ourselves against something. So if you're a man, you identify yourself against women. Now that may be misogynistic in some cases, it may be relatively benign in many cases, but nevertheless, there's always a kind of a distinction being made. And so when we're clinging to our bodies or aspects of our bodies, these are pitfalls that can come up for all of us. Now, form also, while it does involve the body most specifically, if we're talking about ourselves, and our youth, and our strength, and the perfection or imperfections of our body. I mean, some people may identify well with their imperfections, and that may be a real source of problem identity for them. I mean, identities aren't always good things either, I should say. I mean, some of us will say, oh, we identify with the good in ourselves, and that's healthy. None of these, for the Buddha, all of these identifications are eventually a bad idea, but certainly there are some that are more healthy than others. And identifying yourself with things you don't like in your body, it can be, of course, a source of pain right away. But we also identify ourselves with other physical things. So form involves all form that's around us. So we identify ourselves with our possessions, let's say, with our car, with a house that we own or rent, with a piece of land, with a territory, with a city, with a country. These are all physical objects which change. And the issue with all of these that we'll get to at the end, but we should keep in mind all along, is that the problem with identifying with any of these things, whether it's youth or strength or just the way our body is lined up, the problem with any of these things is that they change. Is that if we lock ourselves into a certain kind of identity, we're going to have a problem over time because that identity is going to change. Or rather because that physical thing, in this case, if we're talking about form, that physical thing is going to change. And so if we see ourselves in that form or as that form, then we are going to experience what's called dukkha in early Buddhism, or pain, or a sense of things not being quite right, because we've identified ourselves, let's say, with our youth, but then our youth is going away. We've identified ourselves with our strength, But then as we get older, we realize we aren't as strong as we used to be. Or we can't play the same sports we used to play. This happens to all of us eventually. And I've had people that I've known who really identified with, let's say, playing a sport, the ability to do a certain kind of thing physically with their bodies. And when that fell away, they were really kind of bereft for a while. Now, the second aggregate is feeling. And feeling doesn't mean our emotional states. What it means is what's called in English hedonic tone, which is a technical phrase, but basically what it means is the positive, the neutral, and the negative kinds of feelings that we have. Pleasant feelings, neutral feelings, and unpleasant feelings. So for the Buddha, this is an extremely important part of the mind that tends to categorize things in terms of pleasant and unpleasant and neutral. And we notice this happening all the time. And how can we identify with that? Well, we can create an identity around, let's say, a critic, an internal critic. And I think many of us do this. Again, these kinds of entities are fluid. That's part of the point here. So, we identify ourselves with one way one time, another way another time. And a lot of us identify ourselves with our internal critics. That is, what gives us identity is our ability to say, I like this and I don't like that. And I think we know that in ourselves, and we will probably see it in other people as well. Life doesn't, there's a certain kind of a spark to life, a kind of an insidious spark to life, to finding things that we like and finding things that we don't like, and to making those things public, telling people what we like and what we don't like. This is something that I know I've been guilty of many times, even though more recently I've come to realize, to my chagrin, I think there's an expression people say that, one of the most boring things to hear from somebody is what they like and what they don't like. Of course, professional critics will have very florid and well-articulated ways of saying what they like and what they don't like, so that it becomes more fun and interesting. But nevertheless, the point I'm making here is that we construct ourselves around what we find pleasant and what we find unpleasant. And part of that construction occurs in disputes and arguments. So we'll run up against somebody else. We like chocolate ice cream, the other person likes vanilla ice cream. While that's a trivial kind of dispute, and so we can do it sort of with a smile on our face, nevertheless, it helps to create and bolster a sense of self through conflict. And I think you can tell the undertone here of the point I'm making is that this conflict is really not all healthy. Of course, in the case of vanilla and chocolate ice cream, there's nothing really wrong with it, but we can see how this can escalate and certainly can come into situations that are much, much less benign. For example, political issues, social issues, where we disagree with other people, where there are things that we find very unpleasant that the other person finds pleasant. Even things that are specifically hurtful to us in the sense that maybe it's actually physically painful in some way, but the other person finds it to their benefit in some fashion. And of course, as we know, these kinds of pleasant and unpleasant, can change over time. Things that we found pleasant in our youth, certain kinds of music, certain kinds of clothing. When we get older, we don't. We find other things pleasant and unpleasant, and so our inner critic can change. And if we, let's say, gather friends around us based on those kinds of critical ideas, that can change our entire friendship, a group of friends, our interests. We can see the ways that constructing a self can be problematic because those things all change. The third of these aggregates is perception. And perception in early Buddhism has a larger sense than perception in the West. Perception in early Buddhism isn't just sort of seeing or hearing things, but it's a cognizing of them. It's an identifying of them. So our perceptual apparatus is what allows us to identify something as a tree, or as a person, or as a particular person, or in many, many different ways. We can construct a self around perception insofar as we see ourselves as as cognizers, as perceivers, as people who identify things, insofar as we see ourselves in a certain kind of intellectual mold, as somebody who gets things right, who sees things the way they are, as opposed to other people who don't. And this, of course, is also a part of early Buddhism in the sense that the Buddha did say that the Buddha Dharma allows you to see things as they really are, but part of that seeing things as they really are is eventually letting go, at least in the sense of identifying with, our views. Because perceptions eventually involve what's called view formation in early Buddhism, in the sense that we perceive things, or we think we perceive things in certain ways, and that leads to a kind of a whole suite of sort of cognitive processes that then lead to our coming up with views about the world. So, for example, we see somebody that we identify as being in, let's say, a certain race or a certain sexual orientation or a certain gender or whatever it happens to be, and we come up with a view about them based around that, which is almost certainly going to be incorrect. It's going to be a kind of a fiction. It's going to be based upon our own prejudices. But perception involves our own past. It involves also our prejudices if we aren't careful. And part of Buddhist training, Buddhist teaching, part of the Buddhist path is to eventually try to learn to see through those prejudices that come up automatically through our perceptual apparatus. And of course, I think we can all see the potential dangers with this kind of self-formation, is that if you begin to think of yourself as somebody who gets things right perceptually, who's able to see the way things really are, and who clings to that kind of view formation, clings to that kind of self-identity, in the sense that they identify with the views that come up based on their apparent perceptions of the world, they can become very rigid and hard, sort of hard line about their perceptions, about their apparent perceptions of the ways things are. And that can be also a source of pain. It can be a source of pain for themselves when they frankly end up rejecting things that are clear to everybody else except them. Probably they're clear to them too, but they don't want to acknowledge it. They're just basically being in denial about certain things. That can be a source of internal pain and suffering, even though they may put up a nice face about it. It can also, of course, be a source of pain and suffering to everybody else for obvious reasons, because they may be doing things based on these improper perceptions that are actually harmful to everybody else. The fourth of these aggregates is called volitional formations, or sankharas in Pali. A volitional formation is a very big kind of subject, what exactly that is. But it's basically all of our suite of volitions, of things that make us want to do things, of emotional states. It's the part of the mind that sort of constructs out of perceptions and out of all of this other internal, this data coming into us, that constructs actions, that constructs things to do, the ways to change the world. And so many of us construct a self based around being a doer, being somebody who gets stuff done. As George Bush said, a decider, being somebody who decides things, being somebody in control. Many of us have this kind of, I think, a strong notion of a self as a controller. And this can be obviously a problem in practice. We end up being somebody who doesn't just put effort into their practice, but starts efforting, as they say. The word efforting is sort of a technical term meaning, you're really overdoing it, right? Because you think of yourself as somebody who must be in control, and oftentimes in practice we are not in control. And in fact, part of practice is to realize that often we're not in control, and we're not ever in control as much as we might hope to be and think we are. So, but anyway, we construct a self around this notion of being a doer, of being somebody who gets stuff done, of also being a feeler, being somebody who has certain kinds of emotions, being somebody who is, let's say, overly tender or overly compassionate or overly angry or overly generous or whatever it might be. We construct a self based around these kind of emotions that involve action. I should also say this is part of sexual identity for many of us. It's not just the physical issue, but the emotional issue. How you identify with the sorts of people that you love or that you find attractive. Finding somebody attractive, that's part of sankharas, part of these volitional formations. The way that you react to things in the world. And many of us will self-identify very strongly, let's say, as being gay or being straight or being something else, whatever it might be. And while that can be, of course, any of these can be a place of power and strength, and can be healthy in certain circumstances, in the long term we must be able to see through all of them, to see through them as essentially illusory in some sense, and essentially the sorts of things that pass away. And I mean, ways that these things can change. We can, be in a position of power and control at one point, a doer, a decider, and then all of a sudden that changes. Whether it changes because we lose a job, whether it changes because all of a sudden we're not in the job but we're at home and we have to deal with our spouse or our family or people that we can't boss around, whether it's getting burned out. Many of us will be in positions, let's say, of trying to help people, of being in a certain emotional state, or of feeling a certain kind of control, but we get burned out. That emotional state goes away. That emotional state isn't there anymore because we've been, burning the candle at both ends. These things can change over time, and being able to see through them and understand them as sources of constructed identity is helpful. And the fifth aggregate is the aggregate of consciousness, which is the most, I think, subtle and difficult to understand exactly what it adds to the five. But in a nutshell, it's the idea of just awareness, that there is an aspect of mind that is simply conscious and aware. In the Upanishads and in other aspects of Brahmanism, which predated Buddhism and was around at the time of the Buddha, this was thought of as really the center of the self. People identified with this conscious aspect of the self in the sense that they thought of themselves as mystics, as a kind of a mystic observer, as something outside of the ordinary parts of thought and the ordinary parts of the world. So they didn't identify with the physical world, they didn't identify with, let's say, their volitions, their will, or their perceptions. All those things came and went. But for them, it was consciousness that was the seat of the self. The self was a kind of a mystic observer. The self was a kind of being that didn't change, but simply was a kind of an observer that could not be described. Something beyond concepts. So the concepts that we have are from our perceptions, so they're beyond the perceptions. It's just the mystic observation. Now, for the Buddha, this was not the correct way to observe things, because for the Buddha noticed that there's not simply one form of consciousness or one form of awareness. Instead, there's consciousnesses and awarenesses depending on what kind of sensory organ we're using. So there is visual consciousness, there's auditory consciousness, there's smell consciousness, olfactory consciousness, there's gustatory, taste consciousness, there's a tactile consciousness, and then there's mental consciousness, the stuff that goes on in our minds when we, as it were, have our eyes closed and we're just thinking. So for the Buddha, there were 5 different kinds of consciousness. I should say 6 different kinds of consciousness, and these change. In other words, at one point it will be visual consciousness, and then it'll be mental consciousness, and then auditory consciousness. And so there isn't, for the Buddha, one thing called consciousness. It's something that comes and goes as well. And the important thing to see with all of these 5 aggregates and all these 5 general ways of constructing a self is that they're all essentially illusory. They all arise. All these constructions of a self arise and pass away based on causes and conditions. So at one point we'll think of ourselves as a kind of a mystic observer that is outside of concepts and all the rest, something that's sort of up on an ivory tower somewhere. And another time we'll think of ourselves very firmly as a doer or, a decider. Or we'll think of ourselves as a certain kind of body, that we'll think of ourselves as being somebody who is that beautiful body or is that young body or whatever it might be. So these things change, and we have to see that. That's part of wisdom. We have to understand all of these as essentially impermanent and as essentially not satisfactory. In other words, constructing a self around any of these kinds of, in fact, any way at all, but any of these kinds of ways I've outlined today as well, is not the route towards real deep happiness. In fact, it's a route towards a temporary happiness. And again, they can all be useful in their circumstances. We don't want to say that they aren't. They can be useful in certain circumstances, but they're particularly useful if we don't cling to them, if we understand them as impermanent, as not ultimately satisfactory, as not the way towards a more permanent and lasting sense of ease and happiness and lack of stress, because all of these create their own stress in the wake of the good that they do. But this is only a very small section of the ways that we can create selves. So I'd be interested in hearing what you think. Are there ways that you create a self that I haven't outlined today, or that you can think of? Or problems that you can think of with some of the ways that I've discussed here, problems that can arise based on these senses of self. What do you think? I'd be interested to hear. Put your comments and questions down below. I always love reading what you guys have to say. It's always very insightful, and I learn a lot, and I'm sure other people learn a lot from reading them as well. If you're interested in further sort of topical discussions on these matters and want to lend a hand to helping the channel, check out my Patreon page. I've got a link to it right here. And we hope to catch you on the next one of these videos. So thanks so much for being here, and please be well.